The Hong Kong Plague Medal of 1894 is one of the most obscure medals ever awarded to British servicemen. The work that was required to even be rewarded the medal is even more bizarre, with a trauma that appeared to affect the men. This video will explore the medal, the men who awarded it, and the lasting legacy of the medal. The British had occupied Hong Kong since the first half of the 19th century, and a garrison of the Shropshire Light Infantry were stationed on the island in 1894. The King's Shropshire Light Infantry was still a relatively new regiment, only being formed in 1881 via an amalgamation. The regiment had previously fought in the Egyptian War and had been on garrison duty in Malta too during their short lifespan already. While stationed in Hong Kong, plague would break out in 1894. It was believed that the illness had been brought by Chinese workers coming to the island. 2,500 people would succumb to the illness within the year, and something had to urgently be done. Strangely, it appeared that the garrison was given the opportunity to volunteer their help and services, rather than being ordered to. For those who did volunteer to help eradicate the plague, the plan was this. The soldiers would search streets and overcrowded houses for plague victims. If a plague victim was found, you tended to the sick in a makeshift isolation hospital while disinfecting the houses and streets surrounding them. Soon enough, the job would appear to be much more awful than what was originally intended. Often, the task at hand would include dragging deceased and plague-ridden bodies out of homes and into the streets to be taken away and put into a mass grave. Descriptions of the work carried out still survive from those who served and took part. The commanding officer of the regiment in Hong Kong would state, "If any were found, the dead box or ambulance was sent for and the sick or dead were removed. In some houses, cartloads of filth and rubbish were brought out. The work was hard. The group would enter the first house, place jars in each room filled with chloride of lime, then poured sulphuric acid into the jars, commencing at the top story, and made their way out before the fumes became too strong. The last door was then closed, nailed up and marked. Done." Another description would come from James Lowson, a Scottish doctor working with the regiment. He stated, "On a miserable sodden matting soaked with abominations there were 4 forms stretched out. One was dead, the tongue black and protruding. The next had the muscular twitchings and semi-comatose condition after heralding dissolution. Another sufferer, a child about 10 years old, lay in accumulated filth of apparently 2 or 3 days. The 4th was wildly delirious." Even for doctors and soldiers who had experienced war and injury, the sights of this work were clearly traumatising. Other activities by the regiment can also be seen, such as the burning of residents' belongings. As you can imagine, many began to oppose the regiment's activities as they believed it to be wildly disrespectful to the dead. It would appear the men themselves also began to detest the work, as they were forced into separate quarantine units to the rest of their unit that hadn't volunteered, turning to the extra rum rations that they had been given to cope with the stress of the things that they saw. The soldiers and officers of the regiment also became ill with the plague too. There are conflicting figures, but at least there was 1 officer and 1 soldier that died of the plague. Captain Vassy, who can be pictured here, 3rd one along in the front row, succumbed to the illness, yet the reported soldier to die was never named. Throughout the operation, the unit became known as the Whitewash Gang. By the end of the war on the plague, they would be awarded the Hong Kong Plague Medal. Around 300 soldiers of the regiment were awarded it. Now, throughout my research, I did find time and time again there's reference to other units and soldiers who were given the medal. However, despite all my research, I cannot find any named individual actually awarded the medal that was not in the Shropshire Light Infantry. Here in this picture you can see the Shropshire Light Infantry 4 years later, in Victoria Barracks, peacefully playing cards. Many of the men pictured here may have been awarded the medal, but this is not confirmed as there are no names that are given for this picture. However, it would appear that the man at the back is a Lance Corporal, suggesting he has been a soldier for some years. What interested me, however, is as to what happened to many of the men who were awarded the medal, who had seen the horrors of illness and possibly had to eventually adjust to a civilian life if the prospect of a career in the army didn't materialise. A good example of the life of a Hong Kong Plague Medal recipient would be Private Alfred Jones, who attested for the British Army on the 21st of May 1885 in Shrewsbury. At 19 and a half years old and working as a labourer, he would go into the Shropshire Light Infantry. His service would reveal his extensive time away from home, deploying after only a year as a soldier, landing in Egypt for a year before going into Malta for 4 and returning to Egypt once again for just under a year. His service in Hong Kong would last just under 2 years before returning home and discharging 4 years later. He would be unmarried upon discharge and listed his father Richard as his next of kin. Alfred discharged from the army on the 25th of May 1897. While it is unclear where Jones ended up after his discharge, his service record shows the general character and experience of most men who had joined the Shropshire Light Infantry at this time. It included long periods away from family, little chance of promotion. Many of the men that I found stayed as a private for even 10 plus years in the army. Clement John Holland would be a very good example again, very similar to the last soldier, joining up previously being a labourer. Clement Holland would stay in the army long enough to fight in the Anglo-Boer War at the start of the 20th century, but it would end in tragedy as he would end up in a railway accident that killed many in his regiment, presumably cutting his army service short. Unqualified and injured from his service as a soldier, he would go back to live with his father, finding work as a bricklayer's labourer. Records would show that he would serve during the First World War in the Royal Defence Corps, and even long enough to see the victory of the Second World War, before passing away in 1958. A peculiar example of a Hong Kong medal recipient would be Edward Griffiths. He was originally from Llandewey in Wales and would discharge from the army after 13 years of service in 1900. He would eventually return to Llandewey to become a blacksmith for the rest of his days. Other interesting examples include soldiers such as Captain Wild, who began his career as a private before climbing all the way up to Sergeant Major, later commissioning as an officer, leaving the army in 1910, rejoining once again for the First World War. Another example is Mr. George Goodsell. He found work as a rural postman after his service, before experiencing a tragic death. Sergeant Reed had served all the way to 1913, before rejoining once again in the First World War, serving all the way through to the end of France. Originally, he worked as a miner. Captain Morgan, who once again served all the way through to the end of the First World War. He found numerous jobs, but eventually worked as a landlord at a pub called the Sun Inn. Overall, it is clear that the task taken to receive the medal was harrowing, but many of the recipients would serve in the army till 1918. Many others would leave and live a life pondering on what they had seen in their service in a world where PTSD wasn't understood. Despite the Hong Kong Plague Medal not requiring people to see war, these servicemen had seen the truly harrowing images of death. The Hong Kong Plague Medal is underreported for how truly devastating the work was to achieve it.